Hello and welcome to this special edition, Dialogue with the World, on this Forum 2017 in Rhodos. We are in Rhodos, we are in Greece, and at the South Aegean, and we are at the crossroad between Europe and Middle East. I'm Fanis Papathanasiou with the Greek Public Television ERT, and on this co-production with the Chinese CGTN, we're going to talk about global leadership in the international system. It is obvious that power is shifting from the west to the east. Back in the 90s, we had a system, a model with the United States as the only superpower. Now we have a more complicated international system, which powers including China, the United Kingdom, Europe, and Russia, and others. Today we're going to talk about these issues and going to take some questions, and of course we're going to try to get answers from our interesting panel. But at this point, let me introduce you our co-host from CGTN, Mr. Yang Rei, a distinguished fellow from China, who came all the way from Beijing, and we are very happy to have him here in Greece.
Hello.
Hello. Very happy to have you here.
Right, I'm very happy to co-host the special program with my Greek counterpart, Mr. Fanis Papathanasiou. Yes, everybody is talking about the world order in the age of globalization, when the word globalization itself is being questioned very carefully. Can the U.S. maintain its post-war primacy with the emerging markets asking unanimously to be included in a fair international economic and political order? Is the outdated IATA framework really old, and can it be replaced or renewed? We should also discuss China's solution. Joining us here in this panel discussion are Professor Jia Qingguo, Dean of the School of International Studies at Peking University, and Dr. Vladimir Yakunin, Chairman of the Supervisory Board of the DOC Research Institute. Welcome to our special program.
Thank you.
Fanis.
From this side, we have former Prime Minister of France, Mr. Dominique de Villepin. Very happy to have you here, Mr. de Villepin. And Professor Konstantinos Filis, a distinguished professor from Greece, a special expert in Russia and Greece's foreign policy.
Hello.
So let's start with our question. First to Mr. Yakunin. Mr. Yakunin, we know it is obvious that power is shifting from the west to the east. At this point, who is the boss in the international system?
We do not have boss. Maybe, you know, you are Greek, I guess maybe Orthodox. If not, doesn't matter. There is only one boss on the top in the skies. But if we are talking about politics, we are talking about interests, we are talking about powerful structures, we are talking about political elites, of course, and we are talking about people. By the way, the ancient understanding of democracy as a power of the people still exists. At least I trust this is the truth.
Well, are we talking about Big Brother of the world system, or simply tip of the iceberg in the age of globalization and the world seems to be in crisis? Mr. de Villepin.
Yes, the world is in crisis and facing, unfortunately, many crises. We all know the migration crisis, the terrorist crisis, the crisis of proliferation with North Korea, with the question of Iran, and, of course, economic crisis, financial bubbles. So many challenges and a lot of difficulty, because I'm not sure that the international system has the tools, the capacity, maybe the will to tackle these challenges. That's why we need more leadership.
Europe is in crisis, though, and everybody agrees on that. What role France can play on this? Do you think Berlin is ready for compromises on this matter?
Well, I think that things are changing in Europe. We used to have a very negative view of what was going on in Europe. But after the Austrian elections, after the Dutch election, after the French election, after the German election, even if we don't know exactly how the coalition might be handling things, I think Europe is back on track. Europe is back with the willingness to create something new and to respond to the international challenges. And hopefully Europe might be able to do so, because we need a new spirit of cooperation. We need a new spirit of cooperation with Russia. We need to be able to have a strong dialogue with Turkey. We need to be able to tackle the question of Iran.
Professor Jia Qingguo, do you think the American century is over?
The American century is over. I think is probably an exaggeration for the time being. Okay. The U.S. is probably still the strongest power in the world, and also it still has a lot of vested interests, a lot of responsibilities that they need to take care of. And also, I think as a system, still functions. Even Donald Trump cannot get his way. So, you know, things can change. The American century is not just built on the basis of one election. The American century is based upon, you know, a lot of other factors.
But the United States is pulling out of the global system by rejecting the Climate Change Pact, by pulling out of the TPP, by rejecting the establishment at home, and by rejecting immigration. You can come up with a number of examples to illustrate the American willingness in this new administration to beat a global retreat. At the same time, President Xi Jinping said in his policy speech in Davos, China fully supports globalization and free trade. In sharp contrast, it seems China has been pushed to the forefront. But the next problem and the question, Professor Jia, is whether China is ready.
I would want to add that Trump does not mean the U.S. Okay? I think the U.S. is undergoing a lot of changes, a lot of you know, frustration at the moment.
Professor Phillips, Joseph Nye, who is the guy who put forward the novel idea of a soft power, he's a professor from Harvard University, and he said unilateral action can no longer effectively resolve global issues, and that if America wants to retain its elite status on the world stage, the United States policymakers will need to become more willing to participate in international networks of cooperation. However, the question is America ready for a multipolarized world?
Although I have not yet taken the Nobel Prize, I fully subscribe with Professor Rice on what he mentioned, what he said. Actually, the United States probably is gradually adapting to this new global reality, in the sense that it is not, in my point of view, Trump that laid the foundations for a policy that is more isolationist. There was a trend even from the Obama years. We saw what happened in Syria, for instance, and in other places. And we know that there is a shift in the attention by the United States towards the Pacific Ocean. They are very much less interested in the Middle East. This, of course, has to do with the fact that now they have developed their own energy reserves and they're not so much dependent on the Middle East. This, of course, does not entail that the Americans are not interested in what is going on around the world. But still, it seems to me that they have realized that they cannot do it on their own. They cannot impose their will nowadays. They cannot take unilateral actions in many regions around the world. They need cooperation, and they need to take into consideration the sensitivities of regional powers. We see at the same time that in regional terms, for instance, in the post-Soviet space, Russia has become a superpower in regional terms again. And of course, China is exerting its influence in the wider region, in the South Chinese Sea and, of course, the Pacific Ocean. And therefore, since the Americans cannot impose their will, since they cannot take unilateral actions, and since they can no longer inspire many parts of the world, I think that they have come to terms with this new reality, without this meaning that the Americans and the United States does not still be considered, at least to my point of view, a very strong power in global terms.
Mr. de Villepin, some of the old guardians of American hegemony argue that multilateralism should be viewed as anti-America, and that is very serious for the rise of the rest, because they want the world to be more inclusive. Hence, China put forward the idea of a Belt and Road Initiative to pursue co-prosperity. Do you think that goes against the American global stakes?
No, I don't think that at all. I do believe that this is the movement of history. We have entered in a transitional period where we have both the United States more isolationist and a call for more Europe, more Russia, more China, because the world is both more diverse and more complex. One country alone cannot tackle the immensity of the issues we have to face. Migration, terrorism, proliferation. We need the global community to address these issues. And that's why I really think today we have to find the right tune between these leaders, but also between these people. Because we have not to forget that more and more we are seeing the people of the world willing to speak out. We see it in Europe, sometimes in a negative way through populism. We see it in the Middle East, sometimes in a very violent way. We see it in Africa, of course. We see it in Asia, in China. So this has to be addressed. Civil societies want to be part of history. They want to have their say. And I think we must invent a new way to monitor the world and to address the issues.
Who will structure this new form, this platform, Mr. David Payne?
Well,
because so far, you talked actually earlier about lack of leadership. We have this lack of leadership in Europe, as you know better. But who will show the lead and who will put the framework on this new world order?
I think we have a good example with the environmental issues. The COP21 has put forward all the leaders of the world around the table. Some did want to participate. It was a surprise for some countries that China was at the forefront, with Europe, with France. And maybe it come also to a surprise that the US withdrew from the table. But not only we have the government with the COP21 in Paris, but we have the societies, we have the companies, we have the towns, the cities, we have NGOs. Everybody wants to be part of this adventure. What we have seen in environmental issues, we might see it in order to try to solve crisis. Who might be able to reconstruct the Middle East? We have seen the suicide of Middle East in the last years. Do you think that alone with a couple of $100 billion we might be able to recreate a Syrian society, an Iraqi society? No. We need the people of the world to get together and really put forward solutions.
Okay, but these are important issues in the Middle East, but as you know, in Europe we have a lot of problems with the rise of populism, the extremist terrorism, and we cannot find answers. I will get back to you in a few minutes. Mr. Yakunin, in the new world order as emerges, the leaders, actually the leading powers at this point, would rather be confront each other, compete to each other, or sit down and talk and have the dialogue and exchange as a basis of cooperation?
Listen, with the greatest respect I'm paying to Dominic and to my colleagues, I suppose that, you know, this program presents that despite all the changes in the world, we still are squeezed into the frames of old type of thinking. What we are talking Russia is a regional superpower. You know, I'm a political scientist. There cannot be any regional superpower. That is not compatible. Or we are talking leadership, old style, whether it is United States of America to be a leader, or you used, I don't think tentatively, but you used a very good word. China is being pushed to consider its new leadership. And the question is not whether China is ready, but does China want to replace this leadership pedestal? So to my mind, it is more appropriate in these circumstances to talk not about leadership old style meaning of the word, but to talk about responsibility and to talk about collaboration, cooperation, as Dominic just mentioned. And that is something, though very well known, but well forgotten in newly now existing political structures. Because, you know, isolatism, you know, absence of the ability to listen to each other, ignorance. Why should I learn the neighbor because I don't consider him anything special or anything important? And that is dreadful thing to this existing political system and political situation. If everything in the world should be bound to somebody who is responsible for that, this is not the good way to find a mutual platform for collaboration and cooperation. And what exactly we need now in the face of environmental problem, in the face of the climate change, in the face of inequality, in the face of all crises all over the world, you know, we need the political structures, political leaders, political establishment to be ready to hear, to learn, and to hear each other.
Well, let's go back to the focus of this first part of the discussion. It's about whether the U.S. leadership is over in the 21st century during the presidency of Donald Trump. Now, the thing is, the United States still possess the most formidable military might. The U.S. dollar remains the most important reserve currency, to say nothing of the soft power of its education, and the United States remains the most popular melting pot, meaning the most attractive destination for immigrants in their thousands each year. Having said this, what do you think of the future of the U.S. leadership?
Well, I think the U.S. is going to struggle among themselves, Americans. The people who are willing to follow the old sensible policies since the Second World War, that is multilateral cooperation, working with others, and taking up responsibilities in a way. And people who want to take a free ride, just like everybody else, who want to push, define Americans' interests in a very narrow way, and try to pursue it in a transactional manner. So I think they are going to fight each other. Ultimately, it seems to me that most Americans, especially at the policy level and intellectual level, they would vote for the former. So I don't know, maybe I think the chance for the former to prevail in the long run is real.
Do you think China, having been pushed to the forefront, is ready to assume the leadership? And what does it take for China or other major powers to make a world leadership?
Well, China has been pushed to the forefront, not only by the outside, but also by China itself. You know, our economy has developed so fast that you have to do something about changing your old practice and try to engage with the rest of the world more closely, and sometimes taking some so-called leadership roles. But I think China certainly will play a larger role, will certainly be more proactive in the days to come on international issues. But at the same time, I think I agree with Mr. Yaquni that China is not by any means ready to take a full responsibility of so-called leadership role, and it's not even willing to do so at the moment, because China does not have the necessary capabilities. China does not have the necessary experience and skills. China has risen so fast that it's caught by surprise. So it needs time to adjust,
Excuse me,
to learn.
When you say China is not ready yet, it means we have categorically, we have two groups of people who will shape the future of world leadership or the future of the world in general. First is the political will of the top leadership. The second, the majority of the Chinese, whether they are ready to support the world policy by the new generation of the Chinese leadership after the 19th National Congress. In the first case of the top generation, what do you think of, say, Mr. Xi Jinping's political will to not only get involved proactively in the process of globalization, but also to assume leadership? At the same time, majority of the Chinese say we have a lot of internal problems, environmental decline, corruption, polarization of the income, people getting old before we get rich, so on and so forth. So what do you think of a consensus that needs to be built?
I think both the Chinese leadership and the Chinese people, you know, are divided among themselves with regard to how much role we can play. Even President Xi himself, on the one hand, we have a lot of, you know, interest and need to play a larger role. On the other hand, we do see a lot of constraints, so we have to balance. Okay, with regard to you know, what kind of role China will play, I think China would selectively play a role on international scene at the moment. In some areas which China probably is more ready than in others, probably China would play a larger role in these areas in terms of leadership.
For example, climate change.
Climate change, China is becoming much more ready.
Okay.
Listen, you can clearly judge I am not Chinese.
Okay.
But you know,
But you are between,
I have a lot
you
of friends there and I
Chinese.
study
You are
something.
between two Chinese.
Yes, no, but I'm from Eurasia, right? And I suppose, again, possibly there is a different understanding of leadership, Chinese perspective and, say, globalization perspective in terms of the United States of America. You know, if in the second, that meant domination, no possibility to be wrong. Everything what I'm doing is correct and directed to the global good. Chinese understanding of leadership in terms of protection of environment, for example, does not imply domination. And I'm positive this is not my just, you know, exercises of the brain. I had a lot of talks about that, and this is my strong position.
How can you describe that as a leader? Not domination, but what kind of leader?
For example, Belt and Road Initiative. Yes, it is directed to, you know, to obtain necessary raw materials for the developing economy of China, rapidly developing economy. On the same time, Chinese are investing and they are constructing, you know, infrastructure. Infrastructure, this is not for profit. This is for development. And, you know, because of that, they are not only directing to achieve something for themselves, but they are inviting other countries and other people to be part of this development.
Professor Phillips, what is your views on the new role of China in the international system?
China, in my point of view, is investing economically, and it tries to, in a good way, penetrate economically, financially states or regions. But of course, at the end of the day, it seems to me that it will try to use this economic might and turn it into political influence.
Yeah, why so far doesn't do that? Because it has the power, it has to do, it can do this, can play this role in the United Nations.
They are the Security Council. You have seen and we have detected that China has a very discreet role. Most of the times, even when it uses its power of veto, it coincides with the Russians. It is very careful in how it projects its power. And for instance, in the Middle East, we haven't seen any real attempt on behalf of China to showcase its might. In Africa, we know that the Chinese are investing more money than the Americans and the Europeans invest altogether. But again, they are very careful. In Greece, for instance, which is the gateway for Chinese products to Europe, there are some circles within Europe which claim that we should be careful towards this expansionist, in quotes, policy by China. And at the same time, we know that since we are at the crossroads of three, of Asia, Europe and Africa, we should follow a policy that is multidimensional and pluralistic. We do belong to the West, there is no question about that, I'm referring to Greece, but at the same time we're very much interested in opening doors to the East, and there are many reasons to do that. Historic reasons, religious reasons, cultural reasons, and of course economic ones. And therefore, let me conclude by saying that in my mind, China is not trying, and I fully agree with Dr. Yakunin, to project its power by domination. There is no black and white logic behind its actions.
Excuse me, but when we look at the so-called reluctance of China's leadership during the absence of American primacy in the 21st century, you may have forgotten the Chinese dilemma. What we call the Chinese dilemma might be interpreted as follows. Deng Xiaoping used to call for keeping a low profile in international affairs. At the same time, the dilemma or embarrassing situation for the Chinese leadership and the majority of the Chinese has been, we are neither an economic superpower nor a poor or underdeveloped economy. We are in the middle. So should we assume a strong global leadership without being recognized as a global leader in absolute terms, or should we continue to keep a low profile? You have been a China hand, Mr. de Villepin. From the European perspective, how does China position itself in this ongoing process of geopolitical and geoeconomic reconfiguration?
I believe your analysis is quite right. China is at a turning point. China, up to today, has been playing a two-track policy. On one side, which is mainly economics and trade, I'm an underdeveloped country, and I want to take advantage of this situation in order to have some benefits, some advantages in being able to invest everywhere I want, and on the contrary, to be able to protect my own country. This is true in the logic of investment, for example. On the other hand, because of necessity, China has to take more responsibility because of the problem of the world. So many problems and low leadership of the US, Barack Obama saying, I want to lead from behind, and unpredictability of Donald Trump. This situation has made necessity for China to take action and responsibility. Today, China is the first country in terms of sending troops for the UN as peacekeepers abroad. But can China stay in the middle of the road? This is the question today.
Right, exactly. So what do you think of the China solution? For example, AIIB and the Belt and Road Initiative. The essence of the Belt and Road Initiative, let me emphasize, is China pursues a new world economic order that's intended to be more inclusive, to pursue co-prosperity. Nobody will be rejected by the new, with the outdating of, for example, the Bretton Woods system, and China being listed as one of the major reserve currencies in the special basket of the IMF's special drawing rights, China is emerging fast. However, do you think by raising the idea of a Belt and Road Initiative and AIIB, we have provided the world with a China solution?
Well, I think this example is quite a good example. The One Belt, One Road, the strategy of China and the attitude of the Western countries, mainly Europe, which is concerned. Because China is proposing one solution that is seen by some European countries as being, in a way, a very clever way to be able to pass through world institution, to create its own multilateral institution like AIB, the Silk Road Fund, and it's a way to overcome the others international institution. So that's a misunderstanding between Europe and China. We have to find a way of dialogue in order to make sure that what is the current project of China can be a full benefit for everybody, not a competition between the world system that we know and the Chinese vision of multilateralism. Avoid the misunderstanding. There is a second point where we need to work and avoid misunderstandings. It's strategic investment. Today in Europe, you have a growing fear in some countries that more and more China is buying European companies, which are very important for the independence and the development of Europe. So we want to be better protected. And more voices in Europe are asking for better and stronger protection for the European economy. We don't have the tools that the US are using. We don't have the tools that the Chinese are using. We want to have a legislation which might be able to help us whenever some foreign country wants to invest in Europe. This is a misunderstanding because I think we can find rules that can be understandable for the Chinese and for the European that could make sure that, of course, we respect free trade. Of course, we want multilateralism, but we want to be sure that in some sectors which are key for our economies or that are very important for employment, we are going to have protection in order to be able to respond to the needs of our people. So it's a matter of dialogue, it's a matter also of reciprocity. Today China is always saying...
Because it seems that there is a mistrust in Europe for China. Can Europe and China overcome this mistrust and build a strong partnership?
In other words, there is always the issue of trust deficit between China and the European Union, Greece being the first Western democracy which has delivered Western institutions based on universal values. What is your reply to the alleged mistrust between China and the Western world?
Well, I think there might be some reason because of the power of the Chinese economy, the power of the Chinese company. They have today the capacity, the financial capacity to buy huge parts of our own economies. So it's perfectly understandable, and we have to explain that to the Chinese, that we want to have the possibility of protecting our economies when it's needed, when our independence is in question, but we want also to be able to build partnerships, because I believe the world is about partnership. So the way the Chinese companies are going to come and work in Europe should be more taking into account the cultural situation of Europe, the political constraints, the need, economic need in terms of employment of the people, and it has to be a win-win situation. If a Chinese company comes into Europe, buy a bank, takes the money of the bank, put it in Shanghai in the stock market, then it is not going to be seen as good for Europe. So we have to both adapt our tools, adapt our minds, and try to build up a process of trust and accept rules which should be under the umbrella of reciprocity. Of course, it will take time, but we should work on that.
Mr. De Wilp has been pretty evasive about the sensitive word of human rights. But what's your perspective on the...
I just wanted to give you a hint from a Greek perspective as far as the Chinese investment is concerned. And here I have to stress and underline a hypocrisy on behalf of our European partners. In what sense? We are under an austerity program since 2010. We have asked for investment from all over the world because we needed investment in order to overcome the recent financial issues that we are facing. There were very few, if any, European companies that really expressed their interest in investing in Greece for their reasons. And we had a very big Chinese company, Costco, and the Chinese state, of course, supporting this investment in Piraeus port. And this really gave a boost to Greece. So I cannot wonder why states, European states like Greece, should reject such investments, number one. And number two, Let me also say that China, as you probably know, is investing in infrastructure in many places around Europe, namely Southeastern Europe and Eastern Europe at the same time. So if nobody else is interested in taking these initiatives or in investing, for instance, in infrastructure, why should we exclude the Chinese from this process?
Why do you think China refuses to forge military alliance with Russia? We say we would prefer to have partnership, despite so many joint military maneuvers between Chinese Navy and your Navy.
I suppose this is pure political.
Is it because of also a lack of trust, given the history on our bilateral relationship?
Possible, because we all remember the tension on the Chinese-Soviet Union, border, and that is not long ago. But I suppose this is pure political, because, the term to create military alliances is not that fashionable nowadays. Everyone pretends to say about cooperation, but not about creation of some kind of alliances, because it implies that it is to be friends against somebody. And that is not that attractive nowadays. And by the way, this is true. So from this point of view...
What is true?
The truth is that, nobody wants now to create new, not only Cold War, but actual crisis,
but,
war.
Excuse me, but Russia and China are really facing the military alliance in Northeast Asia between South Korea, Japan, and the United States. The U.S.-Japan Security Pact is allegedly laying the groundwork for the regional security order. I'm not talking about the denuclearization in the divided Korean Peninsula, but in this case, do you think our military maneuvers between Russia and China do aim at their military alliance by treaty?
Again, not about military alliances, but military collaboration and cooperation. Several years ago, while visiting China, I read in Chinese newspaper the estimation of military might of China, and it was considered to be like 10% of the military might of the United States of America. But taking into account the military and nuclear might of Russia, I suppose the military collaboration and good relations between two countries actually are playing a very serious role in calming down very critical situations. As far as I'm concerned, I don't believe that the way, for example, Mr. Trump or anybody is trying to talk to the leader of North Korea, whatever person is, it doesn't matter. This is the state. This is independent state. You like it or not, this is the state. People, millions of people living there. And, openly to declare, listen, we will burn out your country, your people. This is not the way to deal with the crisis at all, and nowadays in particular.
Many people in Europe see China, in a way, behind North Korea. What are your views?
I think China is firmly opposed to nuclear weapons program on the part of North Korea. China also hopes that we would have stability in the peninsula. And China believes that the best way to deal with these two issues is through dialogue and cooperation, negotiation between the concerned parties. But the problem is, the realities on the ground is shifting, given the fact that Kim Jong-un's government wants to pursue the nuclear program regardless of international pressures and persuasions. So as a result, we are facing a very increasingly dangerous situation that we must be very careful about how to deal with it.
Looking into the future, Mr. De Villepin, who will be the big boss? So, as if we have come back to the beginning of our discussion, who will be the helmsman in shaping the future of the world, collectively or unilaterally? What will be the most convincing case from your perspective?
Well, I do believe today you have two poles that may be able to take more responsibility, knowing, and this is a fact, that for the time being, the US administration is unpredictable. These two poles is one side Europe, and I think Europe has the duty to call for more responsibility because of its economic capacity, because of its civilization, its experience, its culture. And the other pole is China, because China today is gaining a global power, military, diplomacy, culture, economy, and global experience. The question is, are these two poles enough? I don't think so. I think we need more countries, more powers being able to wait to find solutions. Take the example of Russia. Russia has shown in the last years that it has a great ability, great capacity to edge on the problems of the Middle East. We need Russia on board. You cannot solve the problem of the Middle East, whether you are talking about the situation in Iraq, the situation in Syria, the situation in Yemen, or in Northern Africa like Libya. We need more involvement of Russia. But we need also to be able to respect and work with regional powers.
But with the Crimea and economic sanctions still imposed on Russia, how do you expect Moscow to play a leading role?
We should have more an introspective look at where we stand as an international community. Sanctions are never a solution if they don't go along with a very strong political vision. Sanctions alone, they create more nationalism. They put in a corner a country. And
are you suggesting clearly, Mr. de Villepin, that there is a growing rift and split in the transatlantic relationship with a particular regard to the economic sanctions against Moscow following Crimea?
I think it exists today a rift in the approach that needs to be taken towards Russia, towards Iran, which is, I believe, because of the agenda, a huge question for all of us. To deal with the Middle East, we cannot have a stable Middle East without Iran, and without Iran having a strong dialogue with Saudi Arabia. So we need to create the situation. And today, the US administration is having a destabilizing role because Saudi Arabia believes, because of its friendship with Washington, they can do whatever they want. They can go on siege against Qatar. They can go and fight against Iran. This is not a good signal. The same with Russia. And that's where I do believe that Europeans should come around the table and discuss their own interest. Our own interest as Europeans is to be able to establish a dialogue on security issues, on economic issues with Russia.
Mr. Prime Minister, why there is no will so far in the European countries to sit down and talk? I've seen Mr. Macron came to Greece and then he went to Acropolis and talked to Europeans about changes in Europe. Is there a real will of Berlin and other powers in Europe to sit down and talk about changes?
I think there is a growing will in Europe, but there is still 2 or 3 different Europes which are looking sometimes in a different perspective. One part of Europe, sometimes Eastern countries, they are looking more towards Washington than towards Brussels or any capital of Europe. They believe that for their own security, Washington is the key. And we should remember from the last months and the last year with Donald Trump that we should not and we cannot rely on Washington. That's where we need a European defense. But to have a European defense in the continent, we need to have a strategic dialogue with Russia. That's why we should be back to work, back on track in really tackling the issues by ourselves. I think you cannot talk about French independence, German independence, Italian independence, if you don't speak about European independence. And that's where we have the same problem. You as Greek, we as French, or the German as Germans, we all need to take our destiny into our own hands, and we know that we are much stronger united, acting collectively, acting with our friends in the neighborhood. And one of the biggest issues for Europe is to recognize that at the border of Europe, we have fire everywhere. We have fire in Libya, we have fire in the Middle East, we have difficulties in Turkey, we have bad relations with Russia. We need to address these issues. You know, why should we care about the problems at the extreme part of the world if we are not able at home to tackle our own issues? So this is to
what about the shift in wealth and influence from the West to the East, as my fellow counterpart Fanny said at the beginning of the program, and therefore the role of China has been featured prominently, together with Russia and the United States working in partnership. What do you think of the advent of the Pacific century, instead of talking about the European Union, which itself is in crisis, and China is rising very fast economically and politically, despite the reluctance of some of the policymakers in our country?
I do understand the provocative nature of your question, but I am well known by the fact that I always was standing for inevitability of reaching the status in the world when we will observe several centers. I avoid to say poles, centers. You know, many years ago during one conference in Singapore, I presented the slide with at least 4 centers. Among them was, of course, China, you know, India. It was American, European, and Russian centers. And I suppose that will be a balance which provides us with the ability to avoid clashes. Of course, you know, existence of several centers inevitably will arouse competition between those centers. But you know, it is much better than to absence of any competition. And I suppose that will be the way. But we are omitting one very essential element. Today, during the conference, during the forum, I was addressing this. You know, usually, old-style politics. We had political agents, we had, you know, diplomatic relations, etc. Regular agencies and, you know, public figures to talk on behalf of the country and to talk on behalf of the people. Nowadays, you yourself can take the computer and you can create the news which will evoke the entire world. This is the simple example that, you know, the political process became much more complex, much more fast.
Are you comfortable with this transformation in the power of globalization?
No, I am not. Why? Because neither legal systems or systems in the world are ready.
Who is controlling this?
Nobody.
Because brings
that is
enormous changes in economy,
this
technology.
Is the problem. Nobody controls this. You know, somebody pretends controls. Now, you know, all the world is talking about blockchain, about, you know, bitcoins, etc. Who created that? You know, this fake story that one ingenious person from Japan invented the entire system, that is only for the kindergarten kids. Nobody but very strong agencies, state agencies, could create this. So possibly we are at the age of huge transformation of entire global system, huge transformation of the usual political processes, and we can observe that some objects of the political process can become the subjects of the political process.
Despite your discourse on the multi-power centers in the post-Cold War era, let me go back to one country you spoke of a few minutes ago, that's India.
Yes.
Throughout much of the Cold War, Russia was a close ally, or former Soviet Union was a close ally of India. Much of the Indian weaponry came from Moscow, and yet with a diplomatic solution to the territorial standoff between the elephant and the dragon, India and China, not long ago we had the success of the Xiamen BRICS Summit. Don't forget the global implications of a catch-up economy, India. India will perhaps become the 3rd largest economy in the near future. So, Professor Jia Qingguo, What do you think of the century of the Pacific region, with India and China playing the first and second fiddler?
Pacific century does not mean that Europe is not important. I think Europe can be very important if it puts its act together. As the Prime Minister said, you know, when European countries are, you know, trying to emphasize their independence, their respective independence, and pursue their interests in different ways, then Europe will not play a larger role. Okay? But if the Europeans can act together, then it can play a larger role. It's good if Europe plays a larger role, so that the so-called Pacific countries, you know, have something to have somebody to compete with, and this is good for both sides. Yeah.
Okay. Now we came to the end of this special edition of Dialogue with the World from Rhodos Forum 2017. We heard very interesting views for very interesting people, and I think, Yang Ray, let's be the beginning, this co-production between ERT and CGTN for the new future and future programs between the two.
Definitely, I fully agree with you. The successful conclusion of this panel discussion here in Rhode Island will only be the end of the beginning. We're going to have a long journey of discovery and rediscovery as we involve so many key players in our joint effort to shape the bright future, a collective one of the world. It's not just the Cold War discourse about who will assume the leadership. It's about co-prosperity, and that is the essence of the Belt and Road Initiative. And if you may, it can be called a new catchphrase on new world economic order, if not a political one. I don't want this catchphrase to smack off a geopolitical rivalry between China, a rising power, and the United States, the existing power. We should forget, perhaps we should put aside the Cold War mentality and discuss the pursuit of inclusive world order. I thank you so much for being with us for this meaningful dialogue here in Rhode Island, Greece. Until next time, perhaps next year we'll have our Greek counterpart in Beijing, the host city, to continue the second chapter of our dialogue with the world.
Because dialogue with the world, dialogue comes from the Greek word dialogos, which is the essence of democracy.
Thank you so much for the success of this brainstorming here in this host island. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.